Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, there is a topic that I have very visibly not addressed on this channel at all in the past. And I've had a lot of people ask me why I haven't addressed it. And as I'm anticipating in advance the comment section to this video, no matter how well I try to thread the needle on this, no matter how much I try to stay unbiased and look at this, it brings out very strong opinions from people, just as politics here in the United States does, or politics in whatever country you are in. And that's the story of what's happening right now in Israel and Gaza. And I say right now, but that implies that what has happened over the last couple of years is somehow new. It's really just a heightened and more escalated version of what has gone on longer than my entire lifetime. So rather than talk specifically about the violence that's happening and has happened over the last couple of years there, I thought the best way to approach this topic was to take a look at it from the standpoint of the history of what has happened with the people of Palestine themselves. There's a lot of different lenses and a lot of different angles through which we can look at this, right? We can look at just the straight history about how the British Mandate of Palestine existed and what happened for the thousands of years before that, or just to pick it up in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. But no matter where we start this story, it's going to leave out needed context. And so this won't be the last time we talk about this, and this won't be the last video that we look at concerning this. So this actually is from a channel that I have not reacted to before, but I watched a couple of his other videos. I haven't watched this one, just to get a sense of the way he was going at this, and it seemed like, at least on the surface, he was being fairly reasonable and even-keeled in his take. So this is from a channel called Elephants in the Rooms, Ken LaCourte. And this specific video is why Arab countries ban all Gaza refugees. Now, don't let that title dissuade you. I think that he uses these titles to kind of be catchy and maybe even a little clickbaity, but I'm hoping he'll get into real substance about this issue, because this is actually a question I have. Having spent a couple of weeks now in Egypt and a little over a week in Jordan, I actually spent a lot of time asking the people in those nations about this topic and how they view it. And I was actually really surprised at the answers. So I'm hoping that's a little bit of what they'll get into today. The only thing I ask, as always, is that the comment section, please keep this to the topic, not to insults, not to name-calling. We can have vigorous debates about all of this without having to be just nasty to each other. So please keep that in mind. Let's dive in.
Nobody want Palestinian refugees. It's true. And specifically, why has every Arab country rejected sheltering any refugees from Gaza? In just weeks after Hamas's October 7th attack, Israel's massive retaliation left well over 1 million Gazans homeless. Today, almost twice that number. About 90% of Gaza's population has been forced from their homes, yet not a single Arab country will open its doors. Why not?
And, this poses the question, I inevitably know that someone will want me to express what I personally think about all of this. And first of all, I'm recognizing up front that this is an immensely complicated situation, but there are certain parts of it that are not complicated. What's not complicated? Well, that innocent civilians are usually the ones who pay the price because of militaries and politicians and people who project violence. So you want to know my opinion on it? My opinion is that every time a civilian dies who's just trying to live their life and isn't somebody who hates the other side, isn't somebody who wants the death of the other side, anytime that happens, it's a tragedy. It was a tragedy, and it was awful on October 7th when innocent Israelis were killed. It's a tragedy, and it's out of line and should not happen every time an innocent civilian in Gaza or the West Bank dies, or anywhere else for that matter. And so whether it's the IDF or Hamas or Hezbollah or anybody else, when indiscriminate violence happens and civilians are targeted especially, or we just really aren't caring who gets caught in the crossfire, then that's what I oppose. So what do I want? I want a peaceful solution. I don't know how that happens. People have been trying for 70, 80 years for one now, and it hasn't happened. And I'm sure that's what this video is going to get into a little bit.
Is it a principled stand to prevent Israel from depopulating Gaza altogether? Or are Arab leaders simply talking a good game about Palestinian solidarity while never actually wanting to help them? As you'll see, it's complicated.
Yeah,
hey, I'm Ken LaCourte. You can find a lot of videos about how one side here is evil and the other side is completely innocent victims. But you won't find too many that try to fairly explain what's actually happening in a conflict that's been going on since before we were born. We'll look at the history of Palestinian refugees, their turbulent history in host countries, and finally take a look at the current situation in Gaza.
And this is all important for understanding what's happening right now over there, and understanding the impossible situation that some of these folks find themselves in.
In the next few minutes, you'll understand a whole lot more about this complicated situation. Okay, so the Palestinian refugee crisis began in 1948. During Israel's creation, about 700,000 Palestinians, about 85% of the Arab population in that region, they fled or expelled from their homes altogether. Palestinians call it Nakba, meaning catastrophe.
And this all goes to the larger issue, which is European powers deciding borders on a map for anybody that they shouldn't be deciding. I mean, I don't know how we do it, but drawing borders and creating countries out of thin air and trying to establish them in certain regions inevitably is going to cause someone who lives in that place that isn't a part of that group to be on the outside looking in. And this absolutely happened to the people who were living there.
Entire villages emptied out overnight. Families escaping on foot or loaded onto carts. They carried what they could. And today, their descendants number almost 6 million people.
Now, it's important to note in all of this, as part of the larger history, that there were initially two-state solutions, right? But, of course, if you're one of these people who finds yourself living inside of the border of a newly created nation that you don't identify with or you don't want to be a part of, now suddenly you've got to figure out what you're going to do. Imagine if the United Nations or some organization came into your community and drew a line down the middle and said, okay, everybody on this side, you're still a part of what you already were before, but everybody over here, you're now part of something completely new that isn't familiar to you. What would you do? What could you do?
Largest and oldest refugee population on Earth. Initially, nearby Arab countries, they assumed it'd be temporary. They set up makeshift camps and didn't try to integrate them into their countries.
And there was a war that happened, right away. As soon as Israel was created, there was an invasion by neighboring Arab countries, which Israel won with help from allies. And that, of course, complicated things even further.
It's important because rather than bringing Palestinians into their societies permanently, they made a choice to house them separately, insisting their real home was Palestine and they'd soon return.
Yeah, and even to this day, when I was in Jordan a couple of months ago, and you talk to people in Jordan, I met some Palestinian Jordanians here. That's what they call them, Palestinian Jordanians. And then they have Syrian Jordanians, because there's like 1.5 million Syrian refugees there. And then you have the people who say, I'm a Jordanian. They definitely see a distinct difference.
Well, that didn't happen. The refugee problem wasn't solved within months or even years. Instead, it dragged on until today. The temporary camps turned into permanent fixtures. Sprawling settlements of tents, they eventually became concrete neighborhoods filled with residents, some of whom still held on to the keys of homes they'd never see again. And then, 19 years later, the situation worsened. During the Six-Day War in 1967, another massive wave of Palestinians, this time more than 300,000, fled from the West Bank and Gaza into Jordan, into Lebanon and Syria. Again, the assumption was short-term shelter until the Arabs won, but again, that just proved wrong.
So, if you're wondering about the West Bank, it's called the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River, which runs down and forms the border between Israel, the West Bank, and then Jordan on the other side. It's when you look at a zoomed-in map, it seems like a big chunk, but none of this is very big. Jerusalem is kind of the westernmost part of the West Bank. It kind of is contained in both Israel and the West Bank, and you can see the lights of Israel, or the lights of Jerusalem, from the east side of the Jordan River. So it's not that far. It's not that big.
The result was overcrowded UN-run camps, swelling even further with Palestinians who were now political pawns trapped in a geopolitical limbo.
Yep.
The reception Palestinians received, it varied wildly between Arab nations. Jordan was the sole exception, which often granted citizenship, especially to those fleeing from the West Bank, which Jordan itself had annexed in 1950.
And Jordan's this fast. First of all, Jordan, absolutely beautiful country, absolutely beautiful people. One of my favorite trips I've ever taken was our week in Jordan. The people were wonderful, some of the friendliest and most welcoming that I've ever experienced anywhere. Amazing history, biblical history, Roman history, Greek history, Crusader history, and beautiful, gorgeous country. It's kind of this weird thing. You've got the king of Jordan currently, who is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. I believe the only Arab ruler who can say that. And he's also the custodian of the holy sites in Jerusalem, so the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but also the Dome of the Rock, and he's kind of responsible for those things. So he's also the son of a British woman, so a lot of complicating factors there.
But even there, integration wasn't smooth or complete. Palestinians in Jordan still faced challenges, political suspicions, and often violent conflicts. Outside of Jordan, the reception was even colder. In Lebanon, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were intentionally kept stateless, forbidden from citizenship, barred from many jobs, and tightly restricted in camps.
So this leads you to the question, well, why, because when I was in Egypt, for example, and we were talking to people in Egypt about this whole topic, I found it curious that, for example, the border is heavily guarded between the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt and Gaza. And the general attitude that I had from people in Egypt, which is an Arab, overwhelmingly majority Muslim country, was Palestinians. Well, those people are angry all the time. We don't want them here. Our behavior, we are responsible for our own behavior. But when you study what has happened for these folks over the last several generations, and you see how they have many times been radicalized because of events, but also by what they're being taught, and you have armed militants who come in and keep these conflicts going very often, or restart them, you start to understand how these people who are kind of caught in the middle of all of this tend to go from being kind of on the fence and just leave me alone to becoming angry and radicalized and wanting to fight back.
Lebanon had a tricky religious and political balance between Christian, Sunni, Shia, and Druze, and it wasn't going to keep a massive Palestinian Sunni population around. A similar situation unfolded in Syria, which kept Palestinians in a permanent holding pattern, tolerated, sometimes welcomed, but rarely integrated into Syrian society. These early conditions set the stage for decades of tension. Palestinian refugees, increasingly frustrated by not having a home, often turned militant, taking their struggle across Arab borders. The Palestinian Liberation Organization emerged partly from these refugee communities, and it became a powerful and armed political force.
So we talk about what happened in Germany, where people who were desperate, who were poor, who were struggling, turned to radicalism because they thought it would solve the problem. And in some cases, that's what you see here. These are people who just feel like nobody's on their side. These other Arab governments aren't really doing anything to help them. And at some point you figure out, well, I've just got to do whatever I have to do to make this happen for myself. Like I said, on either side, whether it's Israel or Palestine or Hamas or Hezbollah, any of these things, violence against civilians is never the answer, but it does help us to understand it, to understand why people make the choices they do and take the actions that they do.
Of course, that made their host countries even more wary, and it laid the groundwork for more conflicts.
Yeah, it's a catch-22. The situation gets created, and then intensify the situation by how you respond to it, and it just escalates and escalates, right? So if you're Israel on the other side of this, you're saying, well, we were attacked on October 7th. Yeah, but then you escalated the situation with the manner of your response. And so, man, it's so complicated because you can see arguments for either side in this situation.
These Palestinian refugee populations had become permanent, distinct groups within Arab countries. They were visible, but rarely integrated, and often distrusted by their hosts. Entire generations grew up in these camps. Children were born, grew into adulthood, and started families of their own.
Some of these kids, that's all they've ever known. I mean, that's what you grow up being taught and understanding about your way of life.
Without ever living in a home country. Now, understanding that history helps explain why, even now, Arab nations are deeply resistant to new waves of Palestinian refugees. Hey, this is a good time to mention that while I spend a lot of time researching this, I'm not perfect. If I make any serious factual mistake, let me know. I'll deal with it in a pinned comment below.
I really appreciate that from him, and I try to do the same thing. And you'll notice occasionally, because I'm watching these videos without having seen them first. Unless I tell you up front, anytime I'm doing a reaction, it's my first time seeing that video. I want it to be organic and fresh, but that can lead to me on the fly misremembering something, and that's why sometimes, even though I'm really sure about something I'm saying, I'll say I think, because I always want to qualify it. And if I am corrected about something I get wildly wrong, I will definitely pin a comment. And this is a great example of a topic I just don't know that well, and I'm trying to understand better. Instead of just imposing my opinion on people, I want to learn and I want to understand.
And if you like stuff like this, now's a good time to subscribe. Okay, so now let's look at what happened next, because the Palestinian refugees reshaped some of the countries that they were hosted in, and often violently. First, Jordan. By 1970, Palestinians made up more than half of Jordan's entire population.
That's insane when you think about it, that because I was surprised when I was in Jordan and they told us that this country of like 11 million people, which is like less than the population of the state of Ohio, had like 1.5 million Syrian refugees from the last 10 years or so. And I thought, wow, that's a huge number. Here in the United States, people are complaining about like 1% of the population being illegal or, being refugees from Somalia and other places like that. And while it may be higher than that in some communities, we have not experienced half our population being refugees from somewhere else, or even 10 or 15%.
Eventually, their welcome wore out and their relationship exploded into violence. It was known as Black September. It pitted Jordan's military against Palestinian guerrilla groups, mainly the PLO. They'd turned the refugee camps into basically armed fortresses.
And what baffled me, really surprised me when I was in Jordan, was the most heavily fortified borders that we saw were the ones between the West Bank and Jordan, specifically Palestinian territories. I didn't see the same level of security and border in the places where it bordered with Israeli territory. And we asked about that, and they were like, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big deal to guard those things, in part because of what you see there. But, Jordan's also had wars against Israel over time.
The PLO essentially created a state within a state. It openly defied Jordan's sovereignty.
Yasser Arafat.
And it tried to overthrow King Hussein's monarchy. After fierce warfare, Jordan crushed the PLO, leaving about 3,400 Palestinians dead and tens of thousands expelled.
There's something you don't talk about, right? I mean, these aren't nearly the numbers that we're dealing with over the last couple of years in the Gaza war, but 3,400 Palestinians dead in a war against a Muslim Arab monarchy.
Black September taught Jordan a painful lesson, and it would never again let heavily armed Palestinian factions operate on its soil. Actually,
and what's interesting is if you look at the flags of Jordan and Palestine, they're almost identical. There's, I think, just the star is the difference.
Most Palestinians by then had citizenship, but thousands were expelled, mainly to Lebanon. And Lebanon got even uglier as the PLO set up shop there. Their armed presence helped ignite Lebanon's civil war from 1975 to 1990, which killed over 100,000 people and displaced about a third of the country from their homes. Militias from all sorts of different sects and outside countries fought viciously, and the Palestinians were often right in the middle of it.
And that's a great point, is that at the end of the day, you're talking about militant groups that are often funded and armed from outside organizations. And there's the civilians caught in the middle of all of it still. And every time one of these wars or one of these insurrections or one of these, conflicts happen, it just makes the situation even more complicated for these Palestinian people.
Even today, Palestinians in Lebanon, they're politically marginalized, they're banned from many jobs, they're denied citizenship, and they're viewed with suspicion by much of the rest of Lebanese society. Kuwait is another example of how quickly Arab solidarity with Palestinians could evaporate once politics shifted. By 1990, about 400,000 Palestinians lived in Kuwait, making up about 20% of its population.
Wow.
And when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Yasser Arafat and the PLO publicly supported him, and once again, things got ugly.
And that's a big deal because I know many of you weren't alive when the Gulf War happened, but that Gulf War coalition was made up heavily of Arab nations who were fighting against Iraq to liberate Kuwait. So you had the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians and others fighting alongside the United States and the British and the French and many other nations in that. And so for the Palestinian Authority to be siding with the Iraqis, that just drove that wedge even further.
Much of the world helped Kuwait kick out Saddam. Kuwait then pushed out almost the entire Palestinian community, about 200,000 who were forcibly removed within months, and another 200,000 barred from ever returning.
Again, people who, I'm sure some of them were vocal in all of this, but many of these people, again, just trying to live their lives, and they get caught in the middle of a political situation.
Yasser Arafat later said that Kuwait's actions were even worse than Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Other countries had less violent but similar stories. Iraq, Libya, Saudi Arabia. Palestinians were often welcomed, at least to some extent, then expelled either quietly or through mass expulsions. Each of these episodes showed Arab states and their ambivalence towards the Palestinian. They're publicly supportive of their cause, but privately suspicious and wary of integrating them into their societies. Keeping Palestinians separate and stateless became, in part, a political strategy, and maintaining the refugee crisis as a leverage against Israel rather than permanently solving it.
That is an excellent point, and right before he said that, that was starting to percolate in my mind a little bit, is that sometimes, and I'm not saying that this is always the case, but sometimes people benefit politically from not solving a crisis, because then they can use that crisis as leverage. It's a lot easier to make Israel the bad guy and to keep your opposition to them when that crisis is still going on. If we solve the Palestinian crisis, if we come up with a two-state solution, well, then it's a little bit harder to make Israel an enemy. So I get that. That makes a lot of sense.
Fast forward today, Hamas fighting Israel. The vast majority of Gazan residents have been displaced, and they have a refugee crisis even more immediate and intense than past conflicts. But despite that scale and desperation, Arab states have again said no.
Right.
Egypt's president and Jordan's king immediately slammed their doors shut. Both leaders openly declared that not a single refugee from Gaza would permanently cross their borders. Egypt even doubled down by heavily reinforcing security at the Rafah border crossing, making it crystal clear Gazans weren't welcome. King Abdullah...
Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. These people have nowhere to go. On the other side, and we'll get into this more, you also have to understand that as the nation of Israel, they do have a right to defend themselves. Now, you can argue about whether they have a right to exist or not. That's a topic for another day. But as they do exist, if militants are in Gaza firing on civilians and launching attacks on civilians, yes, Israel is going to respond, and they have a right to respond. Now, whether or not they've responded appropriately, I don't think they have. Should they have responded? Absolutely. The example I use is that if for decades there had been militants sitting in northern Mexico launching attacks into the southern United States, how long do you think the U.S. would go before they launched a massive invasion of northern Mexico? It would have absolutely happened. Now, that does not excuse indiscriminately destroying civilian areas, even if they're being used to defend your militant strongholds. That's why it's so complicated. But you've got to, you have to keep the civilian casualties intentionally to a minimum. And again, it's the civilians, whether it's Israeli civilians or a lot of Palestinian civilians, who get caught in the middle.
Summed it up this way.
No refugees in Jordan, no refugees in Egypt. This is a situation of human.
That's the king of Jordan. It's it's been interesting to hear how people feel about him in Jordan. They loved his father, adored his father. The feelings on him seem a little more mixed.
Humanitarian dimension that has to be dealt inside of Gaza and the West Bank, and not to try and push the Palestinian challenge and their future onto other people's shoulders.
That's the easiest and safest answer for every government in the Mideast. They clearly understand the danger and instability that a large number of Gazan refugees could bring. They even reject bringing in smaller numbers who might bring the war against Israel with them. Egypt, in particular. It worries about extremists slipping into the Sinai, and that Hamas or another radical group would set up shop there, where other insurgencies are already going on. Egypt knows that more armed factions isn't going to help their internal issues.
Right.
And it also wouldn't help if Katusha...
And Egypt has had its own issues over the last couple of decades, right? You had the Arab Spring, and it's a fairly... I felt perfectly safe at all times when I was in Egypt, but there is just that hint of an element of kind of totalitarianism that you feel when you're there, and there is a bit of suspicion on the part of the government about, large groups of people gathering and things like that, for fear of, an uprising or some kind of unrest happening in their country. So they don't want anything to come in that they think might potentially add to the potential for unrest.
Rockets and suicide bombers weren't coming from Gaza, but from Egypt itself. They're currently at peace with Israel, and they're not looking for any more problems there.
Right.
So the Arab states, they acknowledge the security issues and then emphasize that they're protecting Palestinian claims by keeping refugees in place, no matter how harsh that sounds. It's easy.
Okay, I kind of understand that. If you leave, Israel's just going to move in and take the territory, which is really probably what they'd prefer anyway. And so there's an element of you need to stay there and deal with this, but how?
To condemn Israel's actions loudly than to practically support Palestinian refugees. Political rhetoric, well, that doesn't cost anything. But housing millions of displaced Palestinians, that costs dearly. Security risks, social cohesion, you name it. Palestinians themselves are conflicted too. For many, leaving Gaza feels like permanently surrendering their homeland, exactly what Israel would want.
Right.
And ironically, both Palestinians and Arab states find themselves resisting relocation for different reasons, obviously. That effectively traps Gazans in horrific conditions, caught between Israeli airstrikes and a sealed Arab border. But it leaves us with a fundamental moral and practical dilemma that's still unresolved. Is forcibly keeping Palestinians trapped inside Gaza a principled stand against Israel's pressure, or is it inhumane? So like a lot of things, it's too simple to accuse the Arab states of outright cynicism, using Palestinian suffering as a political weapon against Israel.
It's all so complicated, which is why it hasn't been solved yet. Every answer that you can come up with just creates more questions. Every answer, every solution that you have is going to alienate some group, right? Gosh.
Without genuinely wanting to help them. But on the other hand, there's elements of truth in that as well. Like I said in the introduction, it's complicated. Hey, here's another
Okay, so this was just an introduction to this topic here on this channel. We'll talk more about it here and there. But again, I just ask everyone to be as civil as possible. The bottom line for me is this. The life of a Palestinian, the life of an Israeli, the life of an American, the life of an Egyptian, the life of a Sudanese person, the life of a Japanese person, the life of a Russian, the life of a Ukrainian has value. And every life that is unnecessarily taken is a life too many. And so I pray for peace in Gaza. I pray for peace for Israel. I pray for peace for Ukraine and Russia. And I recognize that in all of these places, in the places in Africa where people are dying because of conflict, in all of these places, it's the people caught in the middle who pay the price. So beyond that, I don't know what to say, just to pray for peace. Thanks for listening.